Today's panel, we have two amazing presenters. We have Nicholas Davidson and Phoebe Jarvis. So Nicholas Davidson is a PhD student studying bioenergy CDT and will be sharing his research on reducing food waste in university canteens. His presentation will give an overview of the problems associated with food waste, the aims and methods of the research, alongside the findings and implications of the findings, including recommendations for similar institutes to reduce their food waste. And Phoebe Jarvis is studying for a BA Politics with quantitative research methods and will share her research on climate denial and communicating climate change. Her research aims to understand what drives denial of existence, human responsibility, and extent of the problem. And she focuses on overcoming inertia, both physically, personally, working towards resilience from being very anxious about the issue and when communicating to others, and highlight how doomsdayers are just detrimental to the progress of denialists. So welcome everyone. Those presentations just sound great. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our first speaker, Nicholas. Let me just stop staring at my screen.
Hi, so I'm Nick and I'm going to talk to you about food waste management. So let me just share my slides. Okay. So why is food waste an issue? Well, a third of all food is wasted globally. And to put this into perspective, around a quarter of all fresh water is wasted on food that's never eaten. And the land area of around the size of China is used to produce food that's never eaten. It results in around 762 billion pound losses globally, which equates to around over £400 per household per year, and contributes towards 7% of all greenhouse gas emissions globally, but it's closer to 8% in the UK. So thinking about food waste management, there are different options, different scales of what's most sustainable. The best thing to do is to prevent food waste at source, so reduce it in canteens and so forth. If this isn't possible, next best thing is redistribute to people, then send it to animal feed. If some food waste is unavoidable, so it's best to recycle it with anaerobic digestion, creating energy and fertilizer, or composting, recycling the nutrients. But the worst thing is to dispose of it, such as through landfill, which creates methane, which is around 25 times worse for regarding global warming than CO2. So looking specifically at food waste reduction options, there are two ways of reducing food waste: behavioral change or infrastructural changes. So regarding behavioral change, you can introduce educational prompts saying, think about your food waste, try and reduce your food waste in canteens. So that's been proven to reduce up to 20% of food waste in canteens. And you can also use signs. So in all-you-can-eat buffet settings, you can say, please don't overfill your plates. Feel free to come back for more. And that can reduce food waste by around 20%. And then infrastructural changes that can help. You can refine the menu to make sure that you're only providing food that people like and getting rid of food that people are less fussed on. So that can reduce by over a quarter of the food waste. You can improve food demand estimation. So you assess how much food people are eating and make sure that you have as little left over at the end of the day as possible. So that can reduce by 65% of what's left over at the end of the day. And reducing plate sizes is a real good option if you're in a buffet setting. So that can reduce by around 60%. And in canteens such as school cafeterias and university canteens, where you pay for what you get, having trayless canteens can reduce by over a quarter of the food waste. Not so much research has been done on COVID-19, the impacts on food waste. But regarding food waste generation, there have been a couple of studies. In the canteen setting, there have been reports that there have been increased awareness of food waste issues and increased effort among consumers to reduce the amount of food that they produce, food waste that they produce, and in the home setting, there's been a self-reported reduction of household food waste generation during COVID-19 with increased planning in the household, meal planning, so making sure you use up leftovers. And this was after an initial spike with panic buying the supermarket. And regarding adaptability as well, as everyone knows, COVID-19 has massively changed our lives, and businesses have had to change regularly to adapt to health and safety guidelines to be COVID secure. So it's a lot easier for them now to make changes. They're a lot more adaptable. And us as consumers, we're used to very varied, very extreme changes in our daily life now. So we're a lot more willing to accept changes that these businesses might make. So my background, specifically looking at UK and Indian universities, these universities typically produce a lot of food waste, want to reduce this waste, aren't sure about how COVID-19 factors into food waste management, and want to know how best to improve their practices and to reduce food waste. So I looked at 2 case studies. One was in a Hall of Residence canteen at the University of Leeds, which had served set meals on the counter and also had a self-service salad bar with 260 students. And I also looked at an Indian university canteen in Mumbai, and that had a self-service all-you-can-eat buffet with 375 students. So the aims of my study were to assess food waste reduction from interventions, assess how much waste was reduced, compare how food waste reduction differed in the UK and Indian canteens, and to identify which were the best interventions out of the ones that I used. So at first I gained a baseline for 1 month of the amount of food waste that was typically generated at these canteens. I then introduced the interventions. Here you can see the posters that I used, the prompt poster, as well as a poster giving feedback on how much people waste and what this equates to in relatable terms. I also used food waste signs saying not to take too much food and to refill if needed, and table cards, various table cards with hard-hitting facts about food waste. So then after this, I gained post-intervention food waste data for a month to see how food waste generation had changed. I also conducted pre and post-intervention surveys to see how attitudes changed after the interventions, and conducted interviews with key staff members and focus groups on the students. So from the surveys, found that there were significant improvements in food waste attitudes after the interventions. However, these improvements were significantly better among the Indian students than when compared to the UK. Table cards were considered as the most effective intervention. However, the posters were also considered highly effective. The UK students cared a lot more about issues such as climate change and personal costs incurred from the food that they wasted. However, the Indian students were a lot more concerned about food security and the fact that the food that they wasted could have otherwise gone to feed those in need. And from the focus groups and interviews, found that there were specific issues arising, creating food waste in the Indian university. So food preference was a key issue because the cuisine in India is incredibly diverse, and there are people from throughout the country. So when people were from very different parts of the country and eating in Mumbai, Maharashtra, they were having typical cuisine which they sometimes didn't like and struggled to eat, so they wasted a lot. So menu changes and having a more standardized cuisine and catering for all the different uh, food preferences was a key opportunity to reduce food waste there. Estimating food demand, how many students are going to go through, how much are people going to eat, was considered a key opportunity in the Indian canteen, especially. Overfilling plates was a key issue in both canteens, so education was needed to reduce this issue, and uh, reducing redistributing surplus food was also seen as a major opportunity in both canteens. So leftover, untouched, perfectly good food at the end of the day could be sent to food charities, supporting local people. And also, both universities found that there were key opportunities to utilize student expertise to promote food waste awareness. So, in the UK canteen, in the UK case study, I managed to do all of my research before the impacts of COVID-19 truly took effect. However, in India, I managed to get the baseline data, carry out the interventions, focus groups, pre and post intervention survey, and so forth before COVID-19 really took hold. But partway through gaining the post intervention food waste generation data, caseloads in Mumbai rose significantly and the university shut down. The data was lost, and it wasn't until around 10 months later the university started to reopen. However, it had a lot of key differences related to being COVID safe and so forth. So the number of students more than halved. The COVID-19 was reported to have changed people's attitudes. There was a change from all-you-can-eat self-service buffet to table service, with the servers instigating portion control. There was improved student number estimation, as the university, for safety reasons, needed to know how many students were there and where they were going, and a lack of outside eating options, which meant there was a lot less surplus food. And also the menu was refined, as a lot of the canteen staff couldn't come back due to COVID. They went back home to their villages. So it was a lot more slimmed down, standardized menu. So looking at the results, in the UK canteen, after the interventions, food waste per capita reduced by around 15%. However, in the Indian university canteen, after the interventions and impacts of COVID-19, food waste halved, so a lot greater reduction. So how does this compare to the literature? Well, the interventions are very in line with the literature. Up to 20% reduction from similar prompts have been found, so 15% is very in line with this figure. And also improved attitudes and awareness after the interventions was reported, and this is what's seen throughout the literature as well. And assuming that the infrastructural changes accounted to 35% of the food waste reduction in the Indian canteen. This is also supported by the literature, standardizing the menu, improved food demand estimation, having table service with portion control, and COVID-19 have all reported to bring about improvements, which is likely would have resulted in such a reduction. So the key recommendations from this is university canteens should introduce similar food waste interventions wherever possible, should really use the pandemic as an opportunity to make infrastructural changes now when businesses and consumers are going to be a lot more adaptable to change, to bring about long-term improvements through table service, improved estimation and refined menus, and also consider adopting other changes such as going trayless and reducing plate sizes in buffet canteens. And to conclude from this, Indian students were more impacted by the interventions. There were cultural specific attitudes and challenges in the Indian university. The interventions can reduce food waste by around 15%. However, there's a greater opportunity from infrastructural changes, and a combination can lead to a halving of total food waste. And COVID-19 should be seen as a great opportunity. So I've just going to very briefly talk about some food waste recycling research that I did. I did it in the same UK University of Leeds Hall of Residence, but on self-catered students. They had opt-in food waste recycling, and I had an aim to see how interventions could increase food waste recycling, how attitudes of catered and self-catered students differed, and identify which was the most successful intervention out of providing information about food waste recycling, getting people to pledge to commit to recycle their food waste, putting fridge magnets on, promoting food waste recycling, and giving feedback emails about how much food waste was being recycled and the benefits, and to assess major opportunities and barriers to improving food waste recycling through conducting, again, baseline data, introducing the interventions, post-intervention data, surveys, interviews, and focus groups. So from this study found that there were significant improvements in the attitudes after the interventions. The pledges were considered as the most effective intervention. However, the presentation was also considered highly effective. Self-catered students considered more economic impacts. They considered them to be more important than the catered students. And the self-catered students also believed that they wasted more food than the catered students. And from the interviews found that economic costs of setting up food waste recycling was the key barrier for preventing food waste recycling occurring in halls of residences. Also, there were key risks of food waste recycling bins not being emptied and hygiene issues related to that. There was also a lot of policy issues, a lack of policy support for food waste recycling that was a key issue. Convenience was a key barrier for students recycling their food waste. Lack of awareness was also a key issue, and the opportunity for students to engage with people to promote food waste recycling and increase awareness.
Nicholas, so you have 5 more minutes.
Sure. So I'll just very briefly say 70 to 100% increase in food waste recycling after the interventions. And so from this, recommend that food waste recycling should be carried out wherever feasible in university residences, alongside similar interventions. And other interventions that can be effective include incentivizing food waste recycling through money or so forth, having more appealing bin designs, and having engagement volunteers to tell people how to recycle and to promote recycling. So the conclusions from this is informative interventions can increase food waste recycling in the university self-catered residence setting by over 70%. Engagement and reducing effort are key to increasing recycling rates. Economics, feasibility, and policy barriers are the key issues stopping recycling occurring in these residents. Student satisfaction, hygiene are the key risks, and food waste recycling can bring about major benefits through reducing greenhouse gas emissions and recycling nutrients and so forth. So should be carried out wherever possible. Okay, yeah, thank you very much for listening, and any questions? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Nicholas, that's great. Okay. So thanks for sharing it, Nicholas, that was very interesting. And if you do have any questions for Nicholas, please put them in the chat or hold them until the end of the next presentation for the Q&A session. So now I'll hand over to Phoebe, our final presenter.
Thanks, Lindsay. That was great, Nicholas, as well. I'll just share my screen. Can everybody see that? Okay, yeah. Cool. So hi everyone, I'm Phoebe, and I am going to talk to you today a bit about my undergraduate dissertation, which, coming from a politics background, I was interested in why there was this kind of international agenda on climate change that had been going on for so long, but it didn't always match up to domestic UK political action. And I wanted to understand why there was that lack of political will and what were the kind of factors behind that driving inaction across the country in the public and in the government. And I'm currently working at the university as a sustainability projects assistant. And I've been lucky enough to keep on thinking about this and talking to people across the uni over the past year. So I kind of wanted to use this presentation to talk about the things that I've learned since doing my dissertation as well, because I think my understanding has kind of moved on a little bit to think about, okay, so this is the problem, but what do we do next? So yeah, and also highlighting that when I was doing my dissertation, I was a bit of a doomsayer in the sense that I wanted to make everybody panic and think about what the problem was. But a lot of what I've learned since then is that that kind of attitude is just as detrimental to progress as denying climate change and burying your head in the sand. So it's both of those things. It's a bit of climate denial and a bit of what to do next. So in terms of where I began, I was looking at kind of the international agenda on climate change and how this aligns to or doesn't with domestic UK political action. So the first kind of awareness internationally and politically on climate change came about in the 80s. And then in the 90s, that was then the warmest decade so far, which kind of proved a little bit of a point. And the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was set up in 92. And in 97, we had the first kind of worldwide target. So there was a lot of countries signed up to that. And that target for reducing emissions was 5% of emissions by 2012 based on 1990 levels, which is very, very, very modest. And the Kyoto Protocol had a second phase after that, which I think was 18% by 2020. And whether or not countries met those targets depends on how you look at the data. Because a lot of cuts were made kind of anyway, or if you discount certain countries, then the whole world's target wasn't met, and it just depends how you look at it, really. But following that protocol, the UK was kind of a leader in this space, and we did quite a lot of emissions reduction. We were way ahead of our targets in the early 2000s. In 2006, we produced the Stern Review, which was pretty groundbreaking in terms of quantifying the cost of not acting on climate change. And in 2008, we had the first emissions reduction target enshrined into law. So our target was bigger than the Kyoto target, and that was 80% by 2050. So 2050 has been thrown around for quite some time now. And part of the reason we were so ahead in the game at that stage was that there was a big scramble for gas in the 90s and a move away from coal, which helped to reduce our emissions. But it wasn't necessarily kind of those deep and difficult changes to the way we work as a country that we needed to actually be doing. It was kind of a byproduct of a change in the energy mix anyway. And then in 2008, we obviously had the global financial crisis, and public awareness and acceptance of climate change really stalled. So I think in 2006, awareness and acceptance that human activity was a big cause of climate change was at 46%, and this fell to 38% by 2012. And by 2018, it had only recovered back to its original figure of 46%. Obviously, that's only one government survey, but it gives some indication as like the level of public awareness and engagement at this time. And the reason is when there's things like a global financial crisis going on, climate change becomes a public interest policy challenge. It's difficult to keep on the agenda. It's difficult to keep in people's minds. And it has real implications for progress. So we weren't meeting our targets in this time in terms of emissions reductions because it wasn't high on the political agenda. And the impacts of that are long running, like we're still not on track to meet some of our carbon budgets in the coming years. And perhaps if we had sustained like real progress during that time, we'd be in a different situation now. And then obviously in the past few years, things have really ramped up in terms of international agreements. We've had the Paris Agreement, climate emergencies have been declared worldwide, which has been really good. And we had the IPCC special report, which gave us the kind of 1.5 degrees figure and that safe pathway for navigating our way out of this crisis. So in terms of what the UK has done, we had a new target in 2019, which was more ambitious. So that was net zero by 2050 with 68% reduction by 2030. And this year, actually, we've got another new target. We like to keep putting those out, but not actually doing anything about it. So our new target now is 78% by 2035, which is the most ambitious target. And it also includes our share of international aviation and shipping emissions, which it hadn't done before. So in terms of targets, we are getting somewhere, which is good. And then my research, I wanted to look at, so, okay, we've got all this stuff going on in terms of international and domestic politics, but how does the psychology work in terms of us as individuals and how that kind of interacts with politics to create certain levels of acceptance of climate change? And I used the British election study, which is a pretty large data set, and it's a kind of ongoing panel survey of the public in the UK. So about 37,000 people contribute to it every time. And I use this data to look into kind of what factors predicted climate change denial. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. But in terms of what climate change denial actually is, I acknowledge that this doesn't manifest as an outright rejection, but it manifests as skepticism and doubt. And this can be of the trend, so that it's happening, of attribution skepticism. So that could be that it's not a human caused problem or not primarily caused by humans. And impact skepticism, which says climate change isn't as big a risk as everyone's making out. So this is kind of the basis of how doubt and uncertainty manifests in the public. So I looked into how that worked, and then I looked into what kind of makes that happen. And primarily it's just like the huge scale of the problem. Like climate change is pretty difficult to comprehend in terms of the size and the scale of it and all the different things that come to play. So ocean acidification, biodiversity loss, everything that's involved is just so difficult to comprehend. And also the fact that it happens over such a long time makes it really difficult to comprehend that we have an impact, because we can't comprehend 150 years. We can only see kind of what's in front of us on a personal level. And so most people use their direct experiences with the weather as a way of kind of navigating that, which obviously isn't the best indication of the climate. And one useful way that I recently learned to think about it was to think of the kind of, you've got your table and your weather is kind of your spread on the table, and climate is the legs that hold the table up. So if the legs are broken, then everything else is on the floor, which we don't want. And then in terms of what we do to cope with this, we have a lot of psychological coping mechanisms which are at play. And we use things like system justification and motivated reasoning, which is where you seek out information that justifies your existing worldviews. And we do that to kind of bury our heads in the sand. And we're very, very good at that as humans, which is not good for climate action. We have a really strong commitment to the way things are. So we need to try and navigate that. And this is a lot more likely to happen when we feel powerless and confused, which by talking about the problem, you can see that's very likely to happen. We also have a finite pool of worry. So we can only worry about so many things at once, which is why when things like the global financial crisis happen, climate change, among other things, falls to the bottom of the list in terms of things that we worry about and care about. And this is all made worse by the fact that there are very vested interests trying to keep us in this situation. So research shows that $1 billion of shareholder funds has been invested in misleading climate-related branding and lobbying by the 5 biggest oil and gas companies in recent years. So there's big forces at play trying to stop change from happening. So with my research, I used the British election study, and this is because it's publicly available and pretty large data set. And I looked at different factors that might increase the likelihood of someone engaging with these processes and kind of using those psychological coping mechanisms to kind of bury their heads in the sand and not accept climate change as happening or human caused or a big risk. And I put all of those 3 variables into one. So it was like either you believe and accept climate change or you don't. So I could analyze it a bit easier. And I found that if those people that were younger were more likely to accept and believe in climate change, those people that identified as female were also more likely to accept. Education has an effect on acceptance. So the more educated somebody was, the more likely they were to accept and believe in climate change. This effect was strongest at the level of higher education. And this is widely acknowledged that education is the biggest predictor of climate change acceptance or denial. So that was to be expected. But also education can strengthen existing views in line with what you believe in already. So if you already don't believe in climate change, it is possible that the more education you have, those views will be strengthened and strengthened. And that's because you've got greater ability to seek out information that justifies those views, greater ability to seek out other groups of people who also share those views. So it's very complex, but it's interesting to look at the data. And there were some limitations to my research. Not everybody answers every question. So I think my sample size was taken from like the maximum of the data set, which was 37,000 to about 2,000, which is a huge decrease. And it's still enough to kind of do the analysis with, but it's obviously like the more people, the better. Another limitation was my quantitative analysis skills, which aren't the strongest. But we got there in the end, and the research was really interesting to kind of undertake and look at. And it's really important because, as I've shown before, you know, it's not a one-size-fits-all policy to getting people on board with climate change. And if we want to keep public awareness high and people engaged and people accepting and believing in climate change, then you need to tailor policy and education and awareness campaigns appropriately. So you need to understand these things to kind of be able to do that. So since conducting my research, I've been lucky enough to be at the university working and to be part of a really good group around eco-anxiety. So we've had some really good discussions and we've read some really interesting texts. And it's kind of a group of staff across the uni. And this has helped to kind of further my understanding beyond my research and to think about what to do next and how to act on that. So in terms of how you do inspire action, both in yourself and in other people, the most important thing I think is having imagination. So if you want to change the world, you need to know how or be able to imagine what it might look like, which I think a lot of people think, yeah, that's fine, no problem. But actually, if I go out and look at the motorway and look at cars everywhere, it's difficult for me to imagine a world in which we don't need a car because public transport is cheap and or free, which would be great, and renewable and really, really good service, and nobody needs to drive cars because that's the world we need to work towards, but it's hard to imagine it. So the first step is keep your imagination working. And then when you're talking to other people about climate change, remember that one conversation won't change their mind. The approach I took, probably as a student and when I was writing my dissertation, was, pile all this information on, make people panic, and something will get in. And actually, no, that doesn't work. All you can do is spark somebody's curiosity and give them something to go away and think about. And, this could be anything. And a way to do that is to frame issues around what is relevant to them. So it could be energy bills, or perhaps they live in a town that desperately needs its town centre regenerated. And that's something to kind of hook people in and get them thinking about it. Not only does it make people care about the issue, but it makes it easy to understand from this huge, complex, global issue that nobody could possibly tackle by themselves. It becomes localized and relevant. And also, it gives people a bit of an entry point for action, which is really, really important to be able to not feel powerless and not feel overwhelmed and confused, which is what, as I showed before, leads to just complete inaction and inertia. And then we can't just talk about it. We need to show that action and believing in a future is normal and easy. So things that you could do here are join a community organising or volunteering group, and just by virtue of being around your friends and family, you will show the benefits of that, because it's quite easy to see being part of your community, being outdoors, being around new people is really beneficial for well-being, and it makes kind of taking that first step towards collective action a lot easier. And in that respect, everybody has leverage points. We all have spheres of influence, whether those are our family, our friends, our workplaces, our communities. So we've all got an entry point. We've all got a way to get involved and a way to stop kind of being paralyzed in action and to start working towards the future that we want to see. And in doing all of this, you need to avoid guilt, fear, and shame. And that doesn't just mean on other people, but also when kind of thinking about yourself and what you pile on yourself. It's not a personal problem, it's a collective problem, and we all have a personal impact to put in, but we're all part of a collective, and no one's going to solve anything by themselves. So yeah, be kind to yourselves as well as other people, I think, is the main point there. And then to finish, just to kind of practice what I preach, we'll talk about some positive news. So obviously the COVID pandemic has been a terrible thing for everybody. And there's been so much financial hardship and people have lost loved ones. But one good thing that's come out of this is it's given us a bit of an opportunity for a reset, which we wouldn't usually have without a war. So following this, we've had massive support for a green recovery, which is just brilliant in terms of progress. And then the result of the past few years of climate action, and also a greater awareness of the problems that climate change causes. We have a record number of people in the UK very concerned about climate change. And in terms of Leeds University, we also have a record number of students engaging with sustainability, which is great stuff. And then 2020 was the greenest year of UK electricity, which is great news. And actually in May this year, we reached a new record in terms of wind power. Wind made up 62% of the energy mix one night in May. And this was a result of some storms that were going on, but it's good to see some progress there. And then in terms of big oil, you know, the ones that are investing all this money into kind of keeping us in the normal that we're in right now, actually there's been a lot of progress in that area. So there's been some companies bringing in new shareholders, which are bringing in new pressure in terms of moving to renewables. And a big one is Shell have recently been sued by the Netherlands for their commitments to reducing their emissions, and they've been ordered to increase their commitments to reduce emissions. And the real impact here isn't necessarily in that one ruling and what it will lead to, but it's in the precedent that that sets, and that is that a court can order a company to change the way they do business based on the safe pathway out of climate change that the IPCC report identified. And it basically says, although the office that was sued, like the top office of Shell, was based in the Netherlands, it basically says that any country anywhere can sue another company for their international impact in terms of climate change, and that can be related back to the country that's suing them. It doesn't matter. It's all kind of connected, which is really good. And then also the International Energy Agency released a global roadmap for the energy sector. And this is really important because that's the International Energy Agency is what governments around the world use to justify their kind of their plans in terms of energy and how they kind of form policies in that area. And the International Energy Agency was set up as a pretty conservative organisation to protect the stability of the world's oil supply. So for them to give us a roadmap out of fossil fuels, saying that all new investments in fossil fuels need to be stopped now, is massive, and it completely removes any justification that countries had to project greater increases in fossil fuel use. They don't have that justification anymore because they would use that International Energy Agency reports. So that's another massive thing that's been really good news. And then again, as politicians like to go on about, global youth action is a massive thing. And instead of relying on that as like the thing that will save us, we're not going to do that, but it is a really, really good thing to see. So you've got obviously Greta Thunberg and organisations like This Is 0 Hour, which is set up in the US. Choked Up was set up in London to tackle air pollution in the city. And then there's a group of Portuguese youth activists which are suing 33 countries in the European Court of Human Rights for their climate inaction. And that's still ongoing. And then Indigenous action in the US has been really important as well. So there's been the Standing Rock movement, which has been set up to and has been protesting the Dakota Access Pipeline now for years, and as well as other pipelines like the Keystone XL. And then also in the US, obviously Joe Biden's just come in, so that's really important in terms of rejoining the Paris Agreement, and he recently hosted the Earth Summit, in which a lot of countries came and kind of renewed and increased their climate targets. And then obviously the big one, we've got COP26 this year, which is hosted in Glasgow, so it'll be really interesting to see what comes out of that. And then I've just included here some further reading resources, and these aren't academic resources, but they are things that I have looked at in the past few months, and I think they're quite easy entry points into thinking about this, and they'll be an enjoyable read as well as an informative one. And I think these presentations will be uploaded to the sustainability website after the presentation if anyone wants to use those links to find out more. And yeah, that's everything. Thank you. Any questions, just let me know.
That's amazing. Thank you, Phoebe. Yeah, both of those presentations were just, they leave you with a lot of like self-reflection. I hope you guys enjoyed. So if you guys have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I have two for each of you if you would like. If no one else has any comments, I'll just wait a minute just to make sure. And okay, Nicholas, how can the students support the University of Leeds to ensure that we're limiting the waste within our canteens?
I think it's a case of any time there's any surveys, just put pressure, say, you know, how interested people are on food waste initiatives and really press things. But I think engaging with sustainability services, maybe putting self forward to represent yourselves, any student groups on sustainability agenda, but also joining any volunteer groups or even setting up volunteer groups, because I think Leeds is quite strong in certain regards, but there are other universities that are incredibly strong with kind of student projects to try and push forward food waste management agenda. I studied in another university in India, in Mumbai, and it was really the students that were pushing forward all the progress. So organising kind of days out, you know, to engage with people on food waste awareness, really pressuring canteens to, you know, reduce waste, to try and they set up food waste redistribution of any surplus food to local charities. So I think just really engaging with any voluntary group and just pushing the agenda. And if you have any ideas or, you know, feel inspired to set something up, then, you know, things can start small and really bloom out and really make a difference. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. Phoebe, how can we effectively communicate the importance of climate change with urgency, but without causing mass hysteria?
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult one, isn't it? Because even I feel like I read about it quite a lot, but sometimes I'll see something and just want to not read it and bury my head and forget about it. So I think if you firstly equip people with the tools to understand how they can act and how they can influence in their own spheres of influence, and to understand their leverage points and to understand their personal impact, but also that it's not an individual problem and they are part of that collective. If people are equipped with that and equipped with the tools to kind of understand and deal with their own anxieties around this problem, and also well supported by the places they work and study and the community and society as a whole, then you can start to communicate the urgency of the problem a bit more, because people have the tools to act. So that kind of sense of urgency and panic won't lead to, okay, let's ignore this problem and just carry on as normal. So yeah, the kind of education around what to do needs to come before the education in terms of this is the problem, I think. But that's a tricky one to achieve.
Yeah, very difficult. Thank you both for your amazing presentations. They were really, really insightful, and I'm sure that everybody enjoyed them. So this is coming to the end of the conference now. So thank you for joining, and thank you to our speakers, of course. You can visit our website. I've got some links on the screen for you to follow, and if you want to reach out, there's the email at the bottom. For any more information on today's session, you can find it on the website, and for other conference-related content, that'll also be on there and all over our social media. So thank you guys so much for joining us today, and we'll see you at the next conference.